Everybody, what is going on? It is Crypto Bobby. Hope you are having a great day, great night, wherever you are watching in from right now. Welcome to a special edition here of Crypto Happy Hour YouTube Live. I have a guest I'm very excited about, Charles Hoskinson. Welcome. How you doing today?
Hey, thank you so much for having me on.
Well, I really appreciate you taking the time, and I know a lot of people out there. I hope a lot of people out there are familiar with you and familiar with the work you're doing in the crypto ecosystem right now. But for anybody who's not, how about just a quick introduction as far as kind of how you got started in crypto and what you're doing right now as well?
Okay, I've answered this question, I
A
think
couple
more than
times.
so very concisely. I'm the Chief Executive Officer of IOHK. We're a cryptocurrency company that specializes in building cryptocurrencies and specializes in the science of cryptocurrencies. And I've worked all throughout the space, from at Ethereum to on projects like ProtoShares and BitShares to the Bitcoin Education Project.
Awesome. Well, I appreciate the quick introduction there, and yeah, like you said, I know you've given that a little bit before. So, just kicking things off, I know you've been in the crypto world for quite some time, and started off, it seemed like, with kind of dipping your toes into Bitcoin, then moving into Ethereum, and now pretty heavily involved with Cardano and a couple other projects. From a high level, what would be your explanation of the difference between Bitcoin, Ethereum, and Cardano, or projects kind of like Cardano as well?
Right. Okay, so these projects live in different generations and they're trying to solve different things. So Bitcoin was the first mover. So it was trying to solve the minimum viable problem for the cryptocurrency space, which is, can you create something without a central issuer and have that thing you've created somehow survive to the extent that people would take it seriously enough to actually trade real money for it? Then can you leverage that to actually build some form of a money, some form of a payment system, some form of value? That was kind of the Bitcoin experiment. And for a long time, we didn't actually know if it was going to work or not. But right around 2013, I'd say an inflection point occurred where not only did it end up working, it worked to the extent that people decided to take it to the next level, which is, hey, this thing is here to stay, but it doesn't give us all the kinds of things that we need to have to be able to do regular commercial relationships. So,
Sure.
in other words, we can't do contracts with it. We can't do programmable business logic with it, all the kinds of things that we take for granted. And how these things were added in with the cryptocurrency space is via a central third party. So, for example, if you want to have a payment system, you put in BitPay. If you want to have some sort of really nice storage solution, you put in a cloud wallet like blockchain or something like that, which kind of defeats the entire purpose of having
Yep.
decentralized money if the only way you can make it useful is to re-centralize
Centralization.
money. So then Ethereum came out and said, well, for a large collection of these kinds of things that you want to do, you don't necessarily have to have a third party do them on your behalf. Instead, you can write them in code and have that code run on a blockchain. That was kind of the promise of Ethereum, this idea of programming language on a blockchain. So
Mhm.
that's kind of like when JavaScript came to the web browser. And, that was kind of a proof of concept. How do you even do that? What do the models need to look like? What's the best model? What's the most efficient model? And so Ethereum charted kind of the same course that Bitcoin charted, where it went from a novelty to something that people universally agree has some form of value. Now we've gotten to the point, just like we did with Bitcoin, where we've kind of outgrown what Ethereum has provided. And we say we want to do real things. And we want to do real things with many people on a scale of billions of people potentially, and on a scale of hundreds of different ecosystems potentially, some legacy financial systems, other cryptocurrencies, for example.
Sure.
And we need to figure out how we're going to manage and govern all of this and pay for all of this. So there's a sustainability component, an interoperability component, and a scalability component, all within that remit. So that's what Cardano is all about, is saying, okay, let's take the lessons we've learned from Bitcoin and let's take the lessons we've learned from Ethereum and let's continue to extend them and take them into new dimensions so that we can finally actually have a system that runs on a global scale with, people of an entire country doing something with it.
Absolutely. And I know you have a focus on peer review and taking things in I don't want to say a more professional approach in some cases, maybe a more professional approach than other projects out there. Can you talk a little bit about how you balance the speed of innovation and I guess the proficiency around innovation, because that's one thing I see all the time is, all these projects kind of rushing to get something out as quickly as possible,
Right.
and maybe it's incomplete or it's not functioning, and then it blows up and backfires in somebody's face if it's an issue with the wallet or something like that. And there's all types of issues. How do you consciously balance the speed of innovation with the product that you're actually putting out?
Right. So it's the old pragmatism versus principles argument. The more principled you are, the better things are done, but the longer it takes and the less competitive you are because you're basically out of the arena while you're refining and polishing things. The more pragmatic you are, the faster you enter the arena, the faster you're actually competing, the faster you're doing things, winning the hearts and minds of people. But the higher the probability is that you're going to make a mistake. So the higher the
Sure.
probability is that you're going to have something blow up in your face, or maybe you got it wrong. You know, for example, if you're Microsoft and you're thinking about transitioning from Windows XP to Windows Vista, what really happened there? Well, with their case, they were moving from an open internet, open web, and really little security by design. Most security was just kind of put on top of the operating system, but it was a fundamentally insecure model to a far more secure model. But there's a huge amount of stuff that had to be rewritten. Device drivers, user experience had to change. It was a massive project. So the question was, how long should Microsoft wait before releasing Vista? If you release too soon, everybody has a miserable experience and doesn't want to upgrade. If you release too late, you spend like 6 years or 7 years without a new operating system update, and all these features are no longer present. And actually, a lot of people argue that they released too soon. So it's the same situation for us. We have a very evolved science division at IOHK. We have lots of great professors. We have a lot of graduate students, a lot of postdocs. We have 3 research centers, and we're expanding that. And we literally spend millions of dollars every year doing basic research into the cryptocurrency space. And we could go to an unlimited level of formalism if we wanted to.
Mhm.
And every little step, like what is a wallet? Well, let's write a formal specification for a wallet. UTXO accounting equivalent to Ethereum style accounts? If yes, why? If no, where are they different? There's 1,000 questions that come up, and these questions are implicitly answered when you implement a cryptocurrency, your opinion on their answer.
Sure.
Or you can answer them in a very academic, peer-reviewed way, and then you have a broader answer that's more community accepted. But every time you do that, it takes 3 months or 6 months or a year. And so you have to decide what battles are worth fighting. So in particular, what we've decided to do is kind of segregate our ecosystem into mission critical infrastructure and nice to have stuff.
Okay.
So mission critical infrastructure are things like Ouroboros. That's the heart of our system. That's our proof of stake system. If we don't get that right, nothing works. You're not going to have a secure experience. You're not going to have low cost validation. You're not going to have reasonable delegation. You're not going to have sharding. You're not going to have anything if proof of stake isn't done correctly. So we said, all right, let's start there first. Let's put the most aggressive, rigorous, peer-reviewed process behind that thread, that product line, and break it into 3 stages. The first stage is principle is security and principles. Basically, all the models and how do you even make proof of stake secure and what do these things need to look like and so forth. The next stage of research is practicality. So after we know it is secure, it does work, it can work, then it's a question of how do we do it so we build a reasonable cryptocurrency. And the last stage of the research agenda is performance. So that's where you introduce sharding, and that's where you introduce the things that allow you to go from a single thread replicated environment to something that grows in performance as you gain
Mhm.
people. So where are we at in the research agenda? We started in 2016 with Ouroboros on the first stage, and that stage is complete. We now know what we know. We've gone through peer review. We've already paid that enormous upfront cost. And we're about halfway through the practicality phase of it. And that's what Shelley is basically all about. So we're just fine tuning things. And by the end of that phase, we would have basically the perfect proof of stake. It's going to have a sidechains protocol built in. It's going to be able to bootstrap from Genesis, so it can emulate the longest chain rule of proof of work. It has all the random number stuff completely figured out. It operates in an adaptive, corrupted, and semi-synchronous model. It has all the bells and whistles. So pound for pound, it's basically identical in terms of security and experience that proof of work has, but then it operates much faster. It doesn't use the enormous amount of energy. It's much more dynamic and responsive to bad actors in the system. And we have a natural path to how we're going to handle sharding. So that's an example of how you blend principles and pragmatism together. Is if you're going to have deeply principled things, you start those first. They go into deep research and you spend years on them. but you don't build a product line at that stage. So that's why we started Cardano back in 2016 from a development science viewpoint, and we entered the marketplace in September of 2017 because we needed to spend that amount of time to kind of figure out how to do these types of principled things. And now we know that thread so well that we can just gradually iterate our way into performance and scaling. So immediately after the practicality thing is done, we have a very natural segue into how do we shard Ouroboros, and it's more of a matter of picking our favorite trade-off profile than it is being brilliant and coming up with new things. Then you have stuff kind of on the outer periphery of Cardano. So you have things like multi-party computation, trusted hardware, DApp libraries, these types of things. And those are less about principles. They're more about when available. You just roll them into the system. And so we've kind of had a big debate about when to add features, how to add features, how do we stay competitive, and so forth. So after March, we're going to move into a regular monthly release cycle for Cardano. So every month, we're going to ship some form of an update, some form of a patch. And when new features come, especially if they're small features like multi-sig and open and ledger integration and paper wallets and these types of things, those will come in those monthly updates. So people, just like with the roadmap counter, can get used to that monthly update and they have an expectation of it. And then really large stuff like the delegation and sharding and these things will come with a big announce cycles like Shelley and so forth. And as we get closer to that, we'll do exactly what we did with the launch of Byron, which is we'll have a countdown timer that count down to it. So we're going to try to mix it up so that every month you get something. And then big stuff, when it's coming, you'll know as soon as we know when that big stuff is coming. And we're going to try to roll that out as quickly as we can. Now, I often get the question of when are we going to be competitive with both Bitcoin and Ethereum, meaning pound for pound. If you say, should you deploy on Ethereum or Cardano, when is that going to happen? So after Shelley, we pound for pound will be much more competitive than Bitcoin ever was. And no reason to use it. Bitcoin is retired at this point. And huzzah. And then Goguen is the next major release, and that's the computation layer release where we're going to add smart contract support. There, we're going to have both legacy support, meaning we're going to run our own version of the Ethereum virtual machine built with K. And then we're also going to have Yella, which is our version of a virtual machine, which is based on LLVM. And then we've maximized interoperability there. So pound for pound, we should have all of that done by the end of the year, almost certainly, and actually perhaps even sooner. So our hope is to be feature competitive with both Ethereum and Bitcoin by the second half of this year, sometime in that range. Then it's just a matter of adding new features and functionality as they become available. Like the next major sprint will be towards scaling. And so that's when we add in Rena, and that's where we add in Ouroboros Hydra, and that's where we add in our data sharding ideas and so forth. And that means that we can gain resources as users enter the system. And then other threads will be basically adding in features and functionality as they become available. For example, multi-party computation algorithms, trusted hardware enhancements, further enhancements to the Daedalus wallet and Daedalus platform as a whole, gradually rolling out the Daedalus App Store, these types of things. And those will be done in monthly increments. And the users will be probably told a month ahead of time, hey, we're probably planning for this. If we can't get it in, it'll be the next month, but that's a way we want to manage it. In terms of audits, we have a monthly rolling audit for FP Complete. They work for the Cardano Foundation, and sometime this month, we're going to release the January and the December audit reports about the good, the bad, and the ugly of our code. It's not all positive. They discovered a few issues, and we were like, we'll fix those, obviously. And then at some point, we're also going to add in an independent InfoSec auditor. We have an internal auditor based out of RPI, and they work with our guys. But it would be nice to get an independent security auditor, similar to what we did with the ETC client with
Sure.
Kadelsky. And the Cardano Foundation will more likely than not be the one who retains them. And then they'll probably audit us at the very least at major releases, like a Byron audit and a Shelley audit and a Goguen audit. But we may be able to get some form of a monthly retainer on that one. It depends on what the foundation wants to do.
So one thing you'd mentioned before is a little bit on the proof of work versus proof of stake. And one thing, and as somebody who has experience on kind of both sides of the house, I'd love to hear your thought process. I know you're kind of moving in the proof of stake model, obviously. With proof of work, do you think a lot of the concerns in the press and all that around the environmental concerns around Bitcoin mining and proof of work mining, do you feel like those are founded in reality? Do you feel like that is a massive concern for Bitcoin and for these other proof of work based cryptocurrencies moving forward? Could you talk about that at all?
So in terms of proof of stake versus proof of work, so we're agnostic as a company. And I think that there's good things you can do both with proof of work and proof of stake. And, both of them are probably here to stay. I don't think there's going to be a situation where we wake up one day and we say, all right,
It's
proof of
all go.
stake is won and proof of work is dead and it's over. Bitcoin is switching on Tuesday and we're all happy. It's almost like a religion. So the first thing that we had to do when we thought about proof of work versus proof of stake is what are we trying to accomplish? Like, what's the goal? You think of a consensus algorithm as almost like an end all be all, but it's a utility. It's a process upon which you try to create a consistent state amongst a group of people. So the first question you have to ask is, what is that consistent state? So we answered that question in 2015. We wrote a paper called GKL 15. It's named after the authors, Juan Garay, Nico Leonardis, and Agalos Kayasas, our chief scientist. And basically, the paper detailed what a secure ledger is. So basically, what is a blockchain? And then the natural question to ask is, does proof of work create that? Okay. And the answer is yes. Proof of work does create a secure ledger as we defined it in GKL 15. Now we have a comparison point. We have a reference point. We have something that proof of work does. And then we can ask the question, does proof of stake create the same kind of ledger? And so that's what Ouroboros was all about. Remember I said we had those three phases. Yeah. We have the theory phase, the practicality phase, and the performance phase. On the theory side, it was all about answering that question. Can proof of stake produce the same type of ledger that proof of work can create? And the answer is yes. Then you get into a practicality question of, does proof of stake have the same assumption set, the same network topology, the same economic incentives as proof of work has? Oftentimes, most of the criticism the proof of work people have against proof of stake has nothing at all to do with the theory side. It has more to do with the practicality side, saying, yes, you could technically create a secure ledger with proof of stake, but the trade-off profile is too pervasive. Usually what they mean is you're ruled by the rich, or you centralize too much, or you have to use checkpoints, or whatever these things may be. They have some pet concern. So we agree with them that the first generation proof of stake protocols did not pound for pound compete with proof of work. In particular, they were very sensitive to bad random number generation. They were sensitive to attacks called long-range attacks. They were sensitive to nothing at stake attacks. They were sensitive to bootstrapping from Genesis, where without a checkpoint, there was no way to discern one history from another history because you didn't have algorithmic weight to base that on, and so forth. But the good news is, using modern cryptography and some enhancements, all of these problems can be resolved. If you use forward secure signature schemes, you can actually bootstrap from Genesis without having to use work. If you use forward secure signatures as well, you can also get rid of the long-range attack. Nothing at stake can also be resolved through similar methods. And then you can also do address segregation, where people can, for example, exchanges can be opted out of consensus, so they don't have any impact over the system. As for the rule by plutocracy, you can create different decision systems to decide who gets elected for a consensus committee, and that's a parameter that can be fine-tuned. And so that's the nitty-gritty of where we're at. But the reality is, people have been thinking about this problem now for about 6 years, and they put an enormous amount of thought, an enormous amount of research. There's tons of academic papers on it, from Algorand to Snow White to others. There's tons of discovered attacks and mitigations to those attacks and so forth. So it's not like we're alone in this and we've had to just figure everything out. It's more been a matter of deciding what the right profile is for a network. Now, I do believe that proof of work also needs to evolve. I mean, it has its own sins. It has selfish mining. It uses more power than the country of Ecuador. There is mining centralization. People tend to ignore that. They say, oh, no, there's no mining centralization. If your pool gets too large, you can just move your miners to somewhere else. It's like, well, hang on a second here. That's assuming that I'm getting all my hash power as a mining pool from the community. The reality is, mining's now a business, and people buy miners themselves and they run them. So you look at yourself in the mirror. Hey, should I fire myself? No. Oh, okay. So I guess I'm just going to keep doing that. And it's also a philosophical discussion of, do you want consensus to be exogenous, meaning outside of your system, or do you want it to be endogenous, meaning inside of your system? And mining is exogenous. It's disconnected from Bitcoin. It's an external force, and therefore it's subject to reality. It's subject to the physical world. If all your miners are in China and China nationalizes the business, now China owns the hash power. That's a physical characteristic. Whereas if it's endogenous, it's built into the chain. If one pool gets compromised, you can move stake to a different staking pool, and that's just a click of a mouse button. So it's a very different conversation. It's a very different type of a setup. As I said, we're agnostic, so we do research in both spectrums. With Zencash and with Ethereum Classic, both of them appear to stay in the proof of work world. So the name of the game there is, how do we make mining more decentralized through non-outsourceable puzzles? How do we make mining useful so it's not wasted electricity? And also, how do we make mining more performant? And so there are things like using DAGs, like Spectre, Phantom, or Elastico, or these types of schemes that allow you to shard the state space. And so we have active research threads going in that direction, and we're going to continue. But we think we have a great thread for proof of stake, and we think that proof of stake is a viable competitor and alternative. And then you can let the market decide what products they like more and where their philosophy tends to be. And I think that's a perfectly reasonable way of going about it. I just wish that people would be more intellectually honest in the conversation, because what the proof of work people have done in particular is they've tried to delegitimize proof of stake. Mm-hmm. There's enormous confirmation bias here. They'll first find a flaw with one proof of stake protocol, and then they'll extrapolate it to all proof of stake protocols. And then anytime anybody criticizes proof of stake, they'll only pay attention to that. And then all the major results about proof of stake, they'll ignore. They'll just, for example, when Snow White was published and Ouroboros was published and Algorand is published, Blockstream didn't make any commentary on it. They just assumed that they were wrong, even though these were papers built with different models, different schemes, and went through peer review. They decided just to pretend these things don't exist. So I think that it's been an intellectually dishonest argument, and I really wish that we can get back to a fact-based argument of what are we trying to accomplish, what level of decentralization do we want, who do we want to be in charge, and how do we want them to be in charge? How do you fire people? How do you move from one jurisdiction to another when a jurisdiction gets compromised? What type of performance profile do you need? Do you need to shard? Yes or no? What level of resource consumption is reasonable? What's your operational cost you want to tolerate for your type of a system? These are all facts. These are all questions that are objective and you can ask, and everybody can have an opinion. But you notice no one's having that conversation. It's just proof of stake is morally wrong or can't be done. It's a perpetual motion machine. It's economically wrong. Here's some paper written by some economist somewhere, and that confirms my viewpoint on reality. So everything you've done in the last 6 years is wrong. And then on the proof of stake side, they say, all you proof of work people want to burn down the world and boil the oceans and raise the temperature of everything. And China owns all the miners, and it's subsidized power, and yada, yada, yada.
It's a little bit in between.
It's somewhere in between. So we focus on both sides.
Totally. One question, kind of even just bouncing all over the place here, but as far as somebody looking to get started, and whether it's just looking to learn a lot more about cryptocurrency and the crypto markets in general, teach themselves something, just become more informed. Right. I know, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think one of the big ways you got started was creating a course back in like late 2013 or in 2013 where you taught a number of people about Bitcoin and about cryptocurrency and kind of the technicals behind it and things like that. How would you recommend somebody get more educated in this space if they are just a hobbyist, if they're an investor? What would your recommendation there be for somebody to become more informed in this ecosystem?
Right. Okay. So first, it depends on how much of a commitment you want to make. If you're an investor, there's a collection of things you just have to do before you do anything. And if you're actually wanting to be an entrepreneur in the space, that's a completely different track. So to the investor in the space, the person who just wants to buy a cryptocurrency, you have to know enough to be able to sort fact from fiction. And also you have to have the ability to store your crypto. Those are the two core competencies to be able to derive. And they're not easy. I mean, we didn't make this is like 1980s internet. So my recommendation is take the Princeton Bitcoin course on Coursera. It's free. It's created by Princeton University. It's a great resource, much better than my class, and much more up to date. And also it has a textbook with it, which I think is also free, or you can get for like $10 or $20 or something like that. And that course has just a great collection of information in it that will get basically up to speed of what are the major points and how does all this stuff fit together.
I'll throw that in the chat right now as you're talking. Sorry about that. I just put the link into the chat.
It's a great resource. And then there are two books I'd recommend getting. One is called The Age of Cryptocurrency, and the other is called Digital Gold.
Love Digital Gold.
And Age of Cryptocurrency, I can't recall who did it. I think it was one of the Wall Street Journal journalists. But anyway, both of them are great because they kind of give you a historical perspective of what the space is all about, who are the leaders, how did it evolve over time, where does the value come from, and so forth. Now, if you do those two things, then you're actually in a pretty good position to then say, okay, I kind of get what this is about.
Yeah.
Then the next thing you need to do is be able to develop a bullshit detector, a filter. Fake news is pretty pervasive. People use it for politics, but the reality is people just say stuff all the time online that's not true. They're pump and dump groups, and there's people on Twitter just running their mouth. So you have to be able to discern what is the realistic nature of the information I'm getting. Like, if I have regulatory concerns, do you have the ability to do a little bit of research and look into the history of how regulators have acted on markets? Because all the time you'll have guys come and say the regulators are going to shut everything down and destroy everything, and you're all going to zero. Like Jordan Belfort, the Wolf of Wall Street, did a video on
Then you
that.
watched Congress 2 days ago, and they definitely didn't do that. So
Exactly, they said the exact opposite of these types of things. And it's not to say that there won't be some challenges or things like that, but you're going to have tons of people advising you, giving you advice. So you have to understand, what is their motivation, what are their incentives, why are they telling me this? Are they a biased news source? And also have a syntopical understanding of it, meaning that get many sources of information before you make any decision. Now, if you're capable of doing that, and actually, if you want to do a self-test, have your friends find 10 news items about cryptocurrency from the past that you don't know about, you haven't been exposed to, and have 5 of them actually happened and are real events, and 5 of them are FUD, and then see if you can discern them and actually, what score you get on that test.
sure.
If you can't, then you're probably going to have a really bad time and get swept up to something. Then have a standard investment thesis. So that means diversify your portfolio. Don't buy just one crypto, buy many. Also, don't put all your money into it. Put a very small part of your overall net wealth into it. Buy on a long time horizon. If you don't think value is going to be there in 6 months or a year, you shouldn't be buying it. You should be buying on a longer time horizon. And finally, be able to store your crypto. Don't leave your crypto on exchanges.
Sure.
And this is a common mistake that almost every newbie in the space makes, is that they leave it on exchange, and the exchange gets hit like CoinCheck, and they lose $500 million. So if you can't store crypto, you shouldn't be in crypto. So that's an obvious case of your deficiency of education. It's very easy to create a paper wallet. It's very easy to use a ledger device. It's very easy to use a multi-sig account or something like that. And there's plenty of secure storage schemes that you can use or ask people for. And if you don't have the ability to figure that out, then you really don't understand crypto at the level that you should possess it at the moment. Now, if you can do all of those things, I think you'll probably do pretty well. And you probably won't lose too much money. Doesn't necessarily mean you'll get astronomical gains, and nor should you, but at least you'll have exposure to the space. Now, as for an entrepreneur, you have to do all of those things. Then you actually have to figure out, why are these things useful for your business model? And the advice I give to every entrepreneur is, just because you can sprinkle blockchain on something, it's just like in the old days when they sprinkled AI or sprinkle IoT or sprinkle social media, it doesn't make it magically valuable. It has to be something that the blockchain component is adding to it, usually meaning you're disintermediating something. But that also doesn't mean, just because you can disintermediate a central party, that that's going to be the optimal way of doing things, or that you can.
One question for you there. So everything out there right now seems to, it's like decentralizing catwalking and like decentralizing Ferrari ownership.
Right.
At what line do you look at something and say, hey, there could be, is there anything in which you look at it and just like, is it common sense for you, or is there anything particularly where you look at something and you're like, this does not need any element of decentralization, or this project is just silly, or anything like that?
Right.
Do you have a thought process on that?
Well, I always do. So the first thing that I look at when I look at these types of projects is I ask, what are the market dynamics? So almost always when you're talking about decentralizing something, you're talking about a multi-sided market where you have buyers and sellers, and there's some sort of center point that connects them together for some reason. So eBay is an example of that.
Sure.
eBay doesn't actually have products. They facilitate a marketplace for people. So in those cases, there's a lot of things like Uber, Airbnb, eBay, and amongst others that do make a great degree of sense to decentralize, because the middleman isn't adding value here. All they're doing is they're just making the transaction safe and secure. They're usually facilitating a marketplace, facilitating a payment system, and facilitating a reputation metric. So if they have those 3 things, then you can reliably do business with people over an arc of time safely. And then you have somebody in the middle to kind of make sure that policies get enforced. If you can write those as smart contracts, that's great. But does that mean you actually have a business model? No. By definition, if you can do these types of things, then it really doesn't make sense for a central company to take a toll and profit from it. So then people say, but what I'll do is I'll tokenize it, and then it's an access token for this particular marketplace. It's like, okay, but does OpenBazaar really need a token? No. That's why it doesn't have one. Nor does decentralized Uber or any of these other things. It's token agnostic. You can use any payment mechanism that you want. So I think that a lot of these ICOs that are trying to decentralize X whatever X may be, unless it makes a natural sense for that to have a pricing mechanism behind it, like it does for Filecoin and it does for Golem and these things, because you're pricing storage, you're pricing computation, and that becomes a unit representing that asset. But when you're talking about a marketplace where goods and services are there, and those goods and services have nothing to do with crypto, they can be selling teacups or they can be selling a car, a hotel room, then you can use any payment medium for that. So it makes no sense to have a token. To your question about decentralization, I think that you can decentralize most things, but there's only a collection of things that make a heck of a lot of sense to decentralize. And that's usually the case where the central party gets too powerful, they get corrupt, and they start causing systemic problems in that marketplace. For example, look at YouTube with deplatforming, where if you have the wrong political viewpoints, you could just suddenly be shut out of your account. All your money gets cut off, and so that means you don't have freedom of speech.
If I drop an F-bomb right now, the good old YouTube algorithm will pick that up and demonetize me in a second.
It's not a hypothetical. I mean, it happened to Jordan Peterson, and it's happened to Sargon, and it's happened to a lot of people on the right, but also people on the left, where they just trip up an algorithm and then suddenly they get shut out of their account and they have to go fight, usually through political pressure and community pressure, to even just get back into the platform. So wherever you see these types of platform level failures as a consequence of too much centralization, it does make sense to chip that up and to create an alternative using a cryptocurrency or some form of a blockchain solution. It does not make sense, though, for every marketplace, and in many cases actually reduces the efficiency or the effectiveness of the marketplace, especially where you need centralization to solve certain problems, and the decentralization is only a partial solution instead of a full solution.
Gotcha. One thing I thought would be interesting is maybe outside of the projects you're involved with at IOHK, is there any cryptocurrency project, or it could be kind of like ancillary to the space just within the crypto ecosystem that you're really excited about and just find very interesting? Maybe you have just zero involvement in, but you think it's extremely exciting or like intellectually stimulating at all?
I really like Steam. I don't like Steam's economics, and I think that the model's broken, but I like the concept of Steam. Mm-hmm. I like the concept of being able to incentivize people to become content creators. The reality is that we have a lot of marketplaces for content creators, which are tremendously predatory. So generally, the people who own those are those who control distribution. It is real bad in the music industry for a long, long time. Sure. Even Prince changed his name over it. He was the artist formerly known as Prince because of all these fights, right? So anything that you can create that allows the person who's created the content to get the lion's share of the ad revenue and the lion's share of the distribution revenue, I think is a great move. And so Steam does that on written content, and then you have Singular DTV that's trying to do this for video content. So I get excited about these types of projects. Usually what's frustrating for me, though, is that the token that incentivizes the creation of content doesn't have a real firm reason to buy outside of speculation. So, if with Steam, it's like, if I'm speculating to buy the token, but there's no ad model. So as a consequence, I have no reason to buy the token, to do something with the token outside of hoping that the token will appreciate. We have a term for that. It's called Ponzi scheme. Value leaks out, and your money comes from other people's money, and those people are speculators. So I do have some problems with the economic model, but I think if it could be tuned, especially if an ad model could be added to it, then it would become a very competitive platform and something that could grow naturally over time and actually provide a revenue stream for people who have become deplatformed from the traditional legacy media world. So I get excited there. We might do something there. I get very excited about things like IOTA and Hashgraph, not because I like the principles.
Getting a lot of questions about Hashgraph in the chat that I'm scrolling through. Hashgraph and DAGs as well,
or the projects, but more because I think that changing the architecture from an append-only linked list to some form of a DAG does make some sense. And you could start having all kinds of conversations like, does Bob actually need to be in sync with the entire network, or can only have a view of it that's incomplete and partial, but still get some reasonable utility and performance? If that answer is yes, the level of performance you can get out of these systems goes up by several orders of magnitude. And in some cases, it's the only way to run these types of systems, because not everybody's going to be synchronized. Not everybody's going to be able to connect or deal with the demands of the system. So I love it when people imagine and they think about new ways of going about storing all this data and storing state, representing state. It's real cool. It's important to point out, though, that DAGs have been around for a very long time. Bitcoin launched with a DAG structure. People don't remember that. It launched with DAGs in terms of transactions. If you look at the UTXO tree, that's a DAG. And there's a paper from IBM Research that even formalizes that DAG structure. So from the very beginning, we've been talking about DAGs. It's just when we say DAG, we're actually talking about the blockchain itself. And there are certain cases where that does make sense to do. In some cases, that actually lowers performance or makes it harder to achieve certain goals. You never get anything for free in distributed systems. There's always something called the trade-off profile. If you expand your speed or you expand the amount of data you can store, you usually sacrifice something for that, like Byzantine resistance, or in some cases, if somebody mounts an attack, your performance goes down exponentially. There's all kinds of things that you have to do. So it's a resilience trade-off, a performance trade-off, a safety trade-off, an availability trade-off. And it's trying to find that right balance. So introducing DAGs is kind of a cool idea because maybe it gives us a better trade-off profile than the existing technology we have, but it's not a miracle that suddenly just makes everything better and then everything gets free and all next generation, and like all the rest of the stuff is old. It's like the the horse and carriage to the automobile. We're not talking about a transition there. We're talking about something distinctly different. Then I have an enormous amount of appreciation for projects that have the courage to innovate on governance. Governance, in my view, is the single biggest long-term problem for all of these systems, because right now all of the systems are centralized. Every single one of them. Bitcoin is centralized. Dash is central. All of them are centralized. And what I mean by that is that there is a small group of stakeholders who, at the end of the day, are making the decisions. There was a recent paper by Sarah Meiklejohn that actually looked at the level of decentralization of Bitcoin and Ethereum compared to open source projects like Clojure. It turns out that a programming language, Clojure, is more decentralized than Bitcoin is and Ethereum is. Okay, so that tells you we have a long way to go. Even the oldest project we have in the space has not yet reached the point where we have a true democracy or we have a true representation.
Do you think that's due to the economic incentives behind it? Is that one of the big drivers of that, maybe in comparison to an open source software project where there's not as much money at play, perhaps?
Yes, I think that's a huge component to it. There's also a disincentive to be informed. It's called rational ignorance. So, the example I love to give all the time is that if you think about why are Americans so underinformed about healthcare, for example, or foreign policy, well, because these are very tricky, complex topics that require you to read lots of books and think really deeply about very complex systems that, unless you work in them, you have no incentive or reason to think about. And guess what? At the end of the rainbow, if you do become informed and you do become an expert on the topic, your vote counts exactly the same as the crazy hillbilly or the crazy hobo or the bleeding heart moonbat liberal in San Francisco. Your vote counts exactly the same as all of these people. So why would you want to then waste hundreds, maybe thousands of hours becoming informed on the topic when your payoff is identical for doing no work whatsoever? So there's an economic term for it. It's called rational ignorance. And so that is pervasive in the cryptocurrency space.
Sure.
People tend to make decisions, have opinions, invest based upon emotions, cult of personality, or political ideology, rather than a fact-based conversation, which creates lots of problems in the space. So I think that we need to find better ways of incentivizing participation. We need to find better ways of creating voting classes of people. We need to find better ways of project governance in general. And that, if anything, if the cryptocurrency space can solve that problem or have a partial solution for that problem, that will change the entire world. Set money aside, because you're not just talking about currencies. You're talking about governance. You're talking about companies. You're talking about governments. You're talking about the whole world. This is actually a revolution of democracy as much as it is a revolution of project governance. And you have the ability to print money to incentivize people to do things. You have the ability to give people tokens to represent special leadership points. You can do all kinds of exotic incentive schemes. So I think that's the great challenge of the cryptocurrency space, but it's also the great promise of the space that if we get it right, it'll fundamentally change what a corporation looks like, and it'll fundamentally change what a government could look like in the long arc, the 10-year, the 20-year, and so forth.
Absolutely. And looking at the crypto market in general now, there's so many projects out there, and a lot of them have very, I would say, repetitive qualities, whether it's transactional cryptocurrencies, platforms, or trying to do similar things. When you look at the marketplace in general or the ecosystem in general, do you view I guess certain classes is like a winner take all type of approach where you think there's might be one specific kind of winner to what it's trying to do, or do you feel like there could be multiple players in each individual space? I'd love your thoughts on that.
I don't think we're going to have a Microsoft Windows style monopoly where there's going to be one that takes all and does everything. That's kind of what the Bitcoin maximalists try to do, and they've built a whole line of thought like, but Bitcoin can do it. It's funny as a diversion. As a brief aside, when I was running Ethereum, I was at the Toronto Bitcoin conference that Anthony Diorio put on. That was back in April of 2014, and we had all these people come in and say, why do you think Ethereum is necessary when sidechains is coming in 6 months and sidechains will be able to copy all the capabilities of Ethereum?
RSK and all that.
You guys are not even going to be in market before sidechains comes, right? So this was the Bitcoin line of thought. Like, there's always something that's coming around the corner that's going to give us the ability to crush all competition and make our system better. Hey, look, man, the human race is not so good at consolidating around a single thing.
Mm-hmm.
We have many languages, we have many cultures, we have many religions, we have many governments. And I think there are reasons for that. People have different opinions and people have different facts and circumstances, and you can't build a system to solve every particular problem, even amongst cryptocurrencies that do the same thing. Technically the dollar does the same thing as the euro, it does the same thing as the renminbi. But why do we have three separate currencies? So similarly, why do we need three separate smart contracting platforms? We could have a single one, but I don't think it's going to end up that way. I think you're going to have regional preferences. You already have regional preferences in terms of web frameworks.
Sure.
If you go to Japan, they still like PHP and they like Ruby. You go to the United States, we seem to be consolidating around all the JS frameworks. There's a lot of progress that's going in that particular direction. You go to Europe, they're still using infrastructure languages in many cases. In fact, they're using Scala to write websites. People are doing pretty exotic things. It's a regional taste and preference on tools. So I think it's going to be the same case of regional taste and preference on infrastructure, and there's going to be regional taste and preference on currencies. And it's less meaningful about who's going to win, and it's more meaningful about how are they all going to talk to each other. The internet of blockchains, basically, what are the standards that will allow us to move value, information, and metadata between all of these different systems and preserve your safety and preserve your privacy and still give you a strong guarantee that your money is not going to be stolen or something like that.
Do you find any of the projects that are focusing on interoperability between some of these cryptocurrencies or between some of these chains, do you find any of them have promise at this point in time, or do you think that it might be a little bit early in the game in terms of really kind of building interoperability between?
That's a good question. So the frustration of interoperability is always that it doesn't really matter much about what you do as much as it matters about what the industry as a whole does. The computer world has been littered like for 4 decades of standards that are perfect on paper, but no one ever adopted. In fact, there's the old joke, we have 16 disparate standards for our industry. We'll create a 17th standard to solve all of them. And then the next XKCD panel is we have 17 standards. We need to solve this. So there are some people in this space, Ripple's in the space with Interledger. We're in the space with our NIPAPOW and non-interactive proof of stake work. Aeon is in the space, and there's a collection of others. And so what we're going to do is say what can be objective, fact-based, and what can be quantitative. Like, what are the actual foundational questions we have to ask about how do blockchains talk to each other, and how do we talk to legacy systems? Because you only have to answer that once, and I think the industry as a whole can consolidate and agree that those are the right questions to ask. They're non-controversial.
Yeah.
Then what will end up happening is people will have very different solutions, very different answers. And then a suite of standards will start emerging from those questions. And then it's just a question of which ones do we bet on are going to be the standard. Content had this issue. Moving from the DVD, some people said HD DVD was the way to go. Some people said Blu-ray was the way to go. And the market couldn't consolidate around a certain standard. And because of Sony, Blu-ray was able to win. But it was a tough battle. But for a while there, you didn't know. And if you adopted the wrong standard, it was even more pervasive because you shipped worthless hardware. Wi-Fi was the same way. They said, which standard should we have? There's A, there's B, there's G. Now the industry's starting to get a little bit better about rolling out a unified standard. But for a while there, it was a little touch and go. And just because you have the best technology doesn't mean you're going to win the standards war. Bluetooth is a great example of that. There were much better ways of connecting devices to cell phones, but Bluetooth just won. And we've had to go through 5 generations of Bluetooth to get to a point where Bluetooth is actually useful and does stuff.
Yeah.
And mostly because companies are forced to take it seriously and forced to build dedicated hardware and so forth for it, like what Apple had to do when they moved away from the headphone jack. So what our strategy is this is a very pragmatic strategy. You asked earlier about principles versus pragmatism. This is far more on the pragmatism side. To be honest with you, I don't care who the market leader is in terms of the standard and what the protocol needs to look like. If it's a real protocol, it's not going to require a gatekeeper. So it's not going to require a token. If somebody's trying to sell you a cryptocurrency and say, our cryptocurrency is going to be that bridge currency between all currencies, and people have to use our token to be the bridge currency, I was like, well, why am I not using Bitcoin then?
Yeah, exactly.
It makes no sense to try to make that a business model. This is going to be a standard like Interledger, or standard like what we've done with our non-interactive proofs of proof of works. And then it's just a question of who's adopted it. And then how many of these standards do I need to adopt to be able to talk to a reasonable chunk of the market? And then by transitivity, the entire market. Then the other side of the conversation is how do we become compatible with non-blockchain systems? So these are the banks of the world. And our hope is that people like Ripple can answer that side of the question, and then we can just turn assets over to the Ripple network when people want to play in that domain. So you would go from Cardano to Ripple and Ripple to your bank account. That would probably be the best way of doing it. It's the most pragmatic way. And they sure as hell have a lot of money and a lot of experience and a lot of momentum. So I think they're doing a far better job than we could do given our connections and in terms of the points. But as a caveat, you do have to understand that the challenge also is not just adoption, but it's also when do you tell people about the price that they've paid in terms of privacy and security and cost? Do you tell them up front, or do you tell them on the back end? All too often what ends up happening with these types of systems is that people don't fully understand the consequences of their behavior. So for example, when you put your money into an exchange, you're not in a cryptocurrency anymore. You're not crypto land. You've left crypto land. You're as good as putting your dollars in a bank account. And a lot of people haven't really woken up to that or don't really understand that. So similarly, in terms of interoperability, when you take your token and you move your token to a different blockchain or to a different system, you are giving up all the guarantees of the system you're in. And you are now accepting the guarantees of the system you're moving into, whatever they may be.
One question I had actually based off that, and it's halfway timely today because Binance has been down and people have just been absolutely freaking out that Binance has been down. And you made a video a couple weeks ago where you had referenced there was a point in time where there were some issues with Cardano and the Bittrex wallet specifically on exchanges. And that's happened with a number of different cryptocurrencies. How do you work through it? What causes an issue like that where there are issues on the actual exchanges with those given wallets, and how do you work through those?
Okay, so with respect to the launch of Cardano, we kind of had this principles pragmatism question of what is good enough for Byron. So my engineers said, boy, we'd love another 6 months. We can make everything perfect. But these guys are Haskell guys, and they live in like moon math world, and it's pretty crazy. And I said, no. If we keep delaying, if we keep waiting to ship something, we're going to have an angry rebellion of people that really want this thing to get out. So we said, all right, well, one of the consequences of shipping a bit early is that we're not going to be able to just immediately launch on a dozen exchanges. Because what's going to end up happening is that as the exchanges use the wallet, the way that they use these wallets are fundamentally different than a normal user. They have lots of inflow, lots of outflow. They have lots of accounts to manage. They batch transactions together. They do all kinds of things that you'll never do if you're a consumer user of Daedalus, just because you don't need to. Basically, while they're doing that, because our test suites weren't sophisticated enough to cover every single one of those use cases, because I've never run an exchange, I can't imagine every way an exchange is going to use a wallet, it's likely going to break the wallet. That's just something we accepted. So what we did is we launched with Bittrex and Binance, and we said, okay, we're going to give these guys a 24/7 support desk. Give them an email that they can send us to. 30 minutes, we reply, and then we can create what's called a Sev1. So basically, we wake up our developers, we go kick them, and 24/7 they're there until the problem gets resolved. And then the goal would be that over a period of time, like 3 months, 6 months, we would learn a lot about how exchanges use wallets, and then we could rebuild our APIs and kind of clean up some of the code so that we can have an enterprise version for these guys. Then we can launch on 12 exchanges, 15 exchanges. And anybody wants to list, they can list, and it's much easier to list. And it's going to be able to perform at that level and that scale. So that's exactly what we did. Unfortunately, when things break, it's Murphy's Law. They seem to break at the worst possible moments. So the last time the wallets broke, they broke both Bittrex and Binance due to demand uh, during Christmas, like literally Christmas Day. And I said, okay, well, I guess I don't get a Christmas. And then we had to detangle a few things, and we're very methodical and systematic about it. So it took us about a week to issue a proper patch. And then Binance and Bittrex obviously had to test it on their end and deploy it on their end. And we're not the only cryptocurrency, so it goes into a queue.
Sure.
So they just take the wallet offline and say, when we get around to it, we'll get around to it. So we had to wait about 2 more weeks for them to deploy those fixes after we'd had them done. And that's fine. I understand that. But we literally had to work on New Year's. We literally had to work on Christmas. It was very, very tough. The good news is since that, we've actually repaired the wallets enough that they're now in a position where they're very stable. And within the next 2 weeks, the complete redesign that we did for enterprise stuff will be done. So starting mid-February, we're going to start pushing out those updates to our exchange partners. And then any exchange who wants to list us, we'll have that branch, and they can use that version of the wallet. And we'll have a nice documentation and other things for them. So we anticipate moving out of February, we'll see a lot more exchanges list us. Now, to answer your question in particular about Binance, I have no special information. In fact, I discovered from Twitter, like most people, that Binance was down. People pinged me and said, "Why is Binance not up?" or something, and they haven't.
Why can I buy him? Why can I not buy Cardano right now?
Right, and I was like, "Oh God, is the wallet down again? Did Binance not tell us?" And they said, "Oh no, it's the website." But you got to understand something, that the exchange the last year have been just hammered.
Oh,
They've gone from a few 100,000 accounts to millions of accounts. And what that does to you is every dimension of your business model goes to hell. Your compliance desk is almost certainly overloaded and takes months to get people through it. Your software that was built to run with hundreds of thousands of users now has to work in an order of magnitude, maybe even 2 higher. And when you go for those step ups, you can do it, but usually you do it gradually. When you do it dramatically, your system breaks. So everybody's having to upgrade their software, Bittrex, Kraken, Binance, and so forth. And that's a pretty natural thing. The other thing is, whenever a big security event happens, like when CoinCheck got hacked, it makes every exchange a little terrified. And they usually freeze up a little bit, and they say, boy, have we done an InfoSec review recently? Have we looked at our software recently? So I suspect that that's probably another thing that's occurring. But I don't have any information on it, so it could be a hack, although I suspect that it's probably just an upgrade. If it's prolonged, like for a week, then then facts and circumstances are different, and maybe it is a hack. And then at that point, we'll see if we can dig in and get more information. But we haven't been told anything on our end about it.
I think they've had some public tweets about it and have said it has not been a hack. So that's good. Hopefully the public output that they're putting out there is solid. So I think it's just been interesting watching. Like you had said, a lot of people complain about the exchanges, whether it's customer service or just the experience. And I don't think anybody could have prepared for the level of increased adoption, at least in like the retail perspective, between especially November and New Year's of this year. But even prior to that as well. It's just like, I can't imagine being a customer support person at one of these exchanges.
Right. You don't build. It's not how a startup works. You don't go ahead and build an exchange assuming you're going to have 10 million customers. You build saying, all right, I'll support up to 100,000 or something concurrent users. And then when we start getting close to that, then we'll plan a redesign, and we'll roll it out over time. And that's normally okay. But what happened is they experienced viral growth. And so they were in the 100,000 person limit, and now they're going to the multi-million. And God, that's hard. You also have to remember, a lot of the people running these exchanges, they're not hardened Wall Street veterans using white labeled enterprise software. No. This is their first business, and they're kind of learning as we learn.
Pulled them out, Cox.
As disturbing as that might be, it's pretty tough. It's hard running an exchange. It's good money on the front end, but on the back end, boy, there are a lot of liability, regulatory liability, MSP liability. You got customers, you got compliance issues, and you got hackers hitting you all the time. If anybody quits, like you have a no call, no show on your employee, it slows you down because you have to immediately ask, oh God, what credentials does this person have? What did they have access to? What do I do?
Hmm.
And when you're an entrepreneur, you're hiring lots of people all the time, and not all of them work out, so you got to let them go. But now every time you let an employee go, it's like you're an intelligence agency trying to do a debrief, preventing them from leaking classified information or something like that. So that's real tough, and you gotta have some sympathy for them. But on the other hand, exchanges do have a moral obligation to try to be as open and transparent as possible
Sure.
about what's going on. Like if you're going to take an exchange offline, you scare a lot of people.
Oh yeah.
You have to let people know up front that you're doing that. The other thing is, if you're going to upgrade your software, then you need to do some form of an announcement proactively. Like Kraken has been doing that, where they say, "Hey, some point we're upgrading our software, and we'll let you know."
We're going to
It
be
would be
down
really
for
nice
2 weeks, but
yeah, every 2 weeks, right? One day we'll have it. I think Jesse's been doing an upgrade now for 2 years. He'll get around to it. So that's my view on the whole thing. And I think over time, things will become more professional. And I think over time, software will get better, especially as meta software gets developed, meaning
sure.
that people write dedicated software for the cryptocurrency space for cryptocurrency exchanges, and they start white labeling that software. Then everybody tends to be using the same system, and we'll see some enterprise standards consolidate. We're already seeing that with like Alpha Point and other things like that. So it'll get better. If it doesn't, well, then we'll issue a statement or something, and because we have a vested interest, right? A lot of
Yeah,
people have traded ADA on Binance, and we need to make sure that the people who hold ADA are okay, and so
absolutely.
we'll do what we can there.
And I know we're coming up on the end of the hour we had scheduled, so I'm not sure if there's anything maybe that I didn't cover or that you feel like would be an interesting talking point, but would love to have your input if there's anything perhaps that I didn't get a chance to
Well,
cover
why
or
don't we
ask you that you
get
feel
some
like would be
questions from
helpful.
the audience, because we have probably a pretty large
Oh yeah,
audience.
so we got let's see how many people we have right now. We got about 13. Let's see. I'm trying to see.
There's
About
14.
15, about 1,400 people or so. So yeah, I could pop into some of these questions. Let me see here. There are a couple people have been asking some pretty solid ones so far. So let me see what we got. If you had a question that I missed, definitely let me know as we go through this. Um, Something about Lambos. I don't know if that's super applicable, but a good one here perhaps. I know we had touched on it briefly, but the Ledger Nano S and Cardano. I know that's something that an ADA. That's something that you said is down the pipeline within the next few months or working towards at some point in time.
Yeah, actually, I just had a meeting this morning with it. So we're rolling out the project in 3 phases. So phase one was all the work that has to be done by Ledger and MetaLayer.
Hmm.
So that's like systems level programming. They're writing C code, and it runs on a microcontroller, and it's very, very resource constrained because these are low resource devices. Then phase two of the project is everything that we have to do to integrate Daedalus into Ledger, so that when you plug your Ledger in, we'll have an interface in Daedalus so that you can control your money with a nice GUI. And
Nice.
also when staking comes, you can do cold staking with the device and so forth. So it's basically a management layer. So there's some stuff we have to do on our API side and some stuff we have to do on the front end to do that. And then phase three is kind of the burn-in test, where everything's pulled together, and then they say, okay, we can update all the ledgers in existence, and if people want to buy new ledgers, it'll support that. So phase one is nearly done. MetaLayer reports, they're the firm that was retained by the foundation to do the integration work, that by the end of February, I think everything will be pretty good there. And then we'll enter into phase two, and that should happen pretty quickly.
Sure.
So we'll have a better estimate in March as we move into it about exactly when. But my hope would be April to May, maybe June, but no later than that, I'd say.
Okay.
And we'll probably do two updates to the ledger. One is to just support ADA, and then a second is from some additional our Cardano ADA specific features, in particular cold staking.
Okay.
So we can do cold staking
Could you
out of the
touch on
box.
that a little bit more as well? I saw a ton of questions as far as,
Right.
as staking goes.
So cold staking works is that when Ouroboros runs, it runs an election, and then it elects 20,600 slots uh, based on the distribution of ADA. Now, Cardano doesn't know if you are a hot address, a cold address, if you're a stake pool, a regular everyday person, you're on a cell phone, you're on a laptop. It's just doing a lookup. It's saying, okay, we have ADA listed, Lovelace listed 1 to 0 to N. We're going to pick X and then look up which address owns it, and that's the winner. And congratulations, your slot 17,640. right? So what happens is when 17,640 comes up, you have three choices. You can either show up, make the block, whoever you are, cell phone person, stake pool person, cold wallet person, you can show up and make that block. You can not show up and not make that block, in which case you're a Byzantine actor, or you can make the wrong block, be dishonest about it, just like a miner trying to broadcast a bad block. Or the third option is that you can delegate your right to a third party, so a stake pool or someone else. So what happens is when you come up, somebody shows up on your behalf and says, well, Rob gave me the right to make the block on his behalf. And they say, okay, show me your certificate. Okay, so those certificates are cryptographic assets. They're like a signature. And basically, they're posted to the blockchain. And when people do that, then they can, they know with absolute certainty that that person has the right to represent you for that particular slot. Now, the question is, should that be an offline or online management? And the best way of doing it is to have Daedalus manage your staking rights. So basically, we're going to put a stake center into Daedalus itself. So when Shelley comes out, it's going to be upgraded in. We'll have a patch that comes out, and you'll just see the stake center. And it'll have a list of all the stake pools. And if you want to become one, you'll also have a registration center where you can register your own pool. And if you want to delegate your stake to a stake pool, you just click it, you click delegate. It's that simple. Now, that works when your stake is online and hot. So what we decided to do is add a layer of disintermediation, where what you do is you take your spending keys and you create what's called a proxy key with it. The proxy key can only control your stake rights, but can't spend your money. So you can leave your proxy key in Daedalus, and then your actual money key can be offline. You can store it in a paper wallet and a Ledger device or all these other things.
That's
we want to make
that.
Yeah, we want to make it really easy to do that. So if let's say your Daedalus gets compromised, your laptop gets stolen or something like that, you can always regenerate another proxy key with your value key. But your value is probably sitting in a safety deposit box, or it's sitting on your cold wallet device or something like that.
So you have the benefits of obviously cold storage with a Ledger, a paper wallet, no access to a hot computer like the Daedalus software on my laptop, but at the same point in time, that proxy key serves as the kind of gateway to that cold storage. That's extremely interesting. I think that'd be a nice direction for the entire industry to go. Just because having that hot access that always scares me a little bit when it comes to staking.
It's going to be useful for all voting. So not only just voting for consensus for staking, but also we're going to have a treasury system. We're going to have voting for hard forks and soft forks and things like that in the system. So all of those capabilities will be basically built into a proxy key model. And we're right now finalizing that design. And actually, we're close to it. I had a meeting this morning about it as well. And I think another week or 2 weeks before we have the last proposal to the security auditors. So how our pipeline works is the scientists develop it, the engineers look at it for practicality and feasibility. And then once both have signed off, we hand it off to the security auditors. And we say, is the scheme secure? And they try to break it. And if they can't, then we say, okay, implement feature. That's kind of the development pipeline. So the science side is done. The engineering side is nearly done. We're about another week or two of just final review there. And then after that, we go to the InfoSec, and that takes another week or two. And then we begin implementation. And the implementation for this particular feature is probably not going to be too long. But the problem is that the implementation for a full client in Daedalus is one thing. Implementation on a Ledger device is slightly different because that's not Haskell. That's like C code, and it's infrastructure, and that's running on a very low resource microcontroller. So the complexity of that is much higher. And you have so little resources to work with, you have to use exotic engineering techniques to be able to get it to actually work in a reasonable time frame. So likely what will end up happening is the first generation of the Ledger devices, the first update that will support ADA will not have the proxy key feature. And then probably the month after, we'll have a follow-up patch, which has the proxy key features for it. But paper wallets likely will, just we won't have it for Ledger.
And we could probably take one last question here if that works with you. It just
came
in from.
I can stay on a little bit longer because we have such a large audience. It'd be nice to actually question.
Awesome. So yeah, we could take a few more. But Martin had mentioned in regards to the design trade-offs regarding sharding, can they be easily changed if they are proven inadequate over time?
Yeah, it's a great question. And if we are good protocol designers, the answer is yes. If we're crummy protocol designers, the answer is no. And one of the reasons we spent so much time, on the fundamentals, the foundations, is we wanted to know how far we could go in any particular direction. So, it's you can either walk into a room that's dark and hope that you can find all the walls and the boundaries without ever turning on the lights, or you can work really, really hard at trying to get a sketch of the room before you walk into the dark room. Might take you a few years to get that sketch. So we spent a few years to get the sketch, and so we kind of know what the room looks like. We kind of know what Ouroboros can do at its theoretical maximums in any particular direction. So Hydra will be our best bet at the trade-off profile, and that'll be a paper we publish probably within the next 6 months to 7 months.
Okay.
Then the next step is implementation of it. And my hope is it doesn't add too much complexity because we've paid a lot of upfront cost in how we've built our architecture. And that'll be something that we push with either Basho or Voltaire, one of the launches. We're not sure exactly where that'll fit, but we'll have a better idea of the exact trade-off profile, and we'll have a better idea of what we've decided to pick for Cardano. But it's important to understand that it's not just Ouroboros, it's also the network side of things, it's also the data side of things. You have to be able to move all that data around. So if you have something that's running at 100,000 transactions per second, the average user will never be able to keep up to date with the totality of it. There's just no way, because they'll be on you need to be on like 150 megabit per second internet connection, and reliable every second spraying at them. So instead, they're subscribing to data feeds, and that's a different architecture. That's a heterogeneous multicast model as opposed to a homogeneous gossip model. So you need to think a little differently about what does it mean to be in sync with the network, and what does it mean to be able to do what you want to do in the network. So we're right now thinking about that. The long-term strategy is RENA. So you use UDP to enter this kind of like super private network called RENA, Recursive Internetwork Architecture, and it has a philosophy on how to handle all those problems. But that is going to take about a year to build. So it's a question of how do we iterate our way to it, so that the first generation is pretty good, and then we get a lot of evidence, and then we go to the next generation, and so forth. So that's going to be the great struggle of 2019, I'd say. 2018 is all about catching up with Ethereum and Bitcoin and building a viable, great, usable ecosystem. So mobile clients, multi-sig, paper wallets, hardware wallets, lots of exchange access, being able to write dApps and deploy them on the system safely and securely, and just getting this model out there and getting people used to it and getting the brand out there. And then 2019 is all about now making us basically able to deal with the challenges of having millions of users and billions of users, and in many cases different models of thought, whether they be different computational models or they be different different accounting models, these types of things, and adding that into the system over time, and also adding new capabilities then, like trusted hardware and MPC and so forth. So that's what the great challenge of 2019 is going to be, and the research for that is ongoing. And as we exit practicality, performance will be the final part of the Ouroboros research agenda, and that's when that trade-off profile gets discussed. Now, the exciting thing about it is that we're not the only player in this space. It's actually very fertile. You look at the amount of papers that are coming out. There's Plasma and Polkadot, and that's on the industry side. EOS has some ideas. Whether they're viable or not, but they claim they are. Then there's academic papers like Thunderella and Elastico and OmniLedger and Phantom, and all of these things carry a way of breaking your network up into shards as opposed to a monolithic replicated system. And so there's a lot that can be learned from that. So it's less about are we super brilliant and super creative, and it's more about which one of these makes the most sense, which one of these approaches for the type of ecosystem we want to build, given that we need to shard a blockchain, given that we need to shard the data layer, and we anticipate having billions of users in the system over a long arc of time, like 10 years or 20 years.
Sure. One, it's kind of I personally think a silly question, but I've seen it asked a bunch of times. Is there any plan to have a Cardano credit card? Is there any usefulness to that? I've seen a bunch of questions and people fighting in the comments right now about, I'd love to see a Cardano credit card, or why the hell do we need a Cardano credit card? So
the Cardano Foundation wants to have an ADA debit card. They think it's very important for user adoption, and it's very important for merchant adoption, and important just to prove a point that these systems can actually be useful outside of just a bespoke context. And I think philosophically it makes a lot of sense, and there's certainly companies that have tried to make this space work, like Zappo.
Yep.
So IOHK isn't directly involved in that. The Cardano Foundation is leading that effort. Michael Parsons has some dedicated people at the foundation who are negotiating and trying to roll out these deals. I don't know exactly where they're at. I am going to London this month, and I'll probably meet with the foundation and might be able to get some more information about where exactly in the cycle they're at. The problem is that it's kind of an ebb and flow. For a while, MasterCard and Visa were actually quite excited about the prospect of these new channels because they could charge very high fees, and they were great for them. But then they got really worried about the regulatory risk, and we've seen a contraction in this market and blacklisting and so forth. Not globally speaking, So it is certainly possible in certain jurisdictions to have an ADA card, but then there's a question of, will it ever be useful? The fees have to be sufficiently low. You have to have a way of managing volatility. You have to have an easy way of getting cash in and getting cash out. And you have to have reasonable spending limits too. For example, Japan is changing their cryptocurrency debit card regulations. And some of the proposals I've seen are like, you can lifetime value of the card. You can't spend more than $1,500. Lifetime.
What's the purpose of it?
Just useless to have that type of a thing. So that's the FSA's decision, and that's Visa and MasterCard's decision. It's less about what we want to do and more about what governments will permit and these infrastructure providers to permit. But a caveat to this is that Visa and MasterCard are losing power, and it has nothing to do with IOHK or Cardano or cryptocurrencies even. It's because of Apple Pay and Samsung Pay and Google Pay and so forth. POSs are becoming programmable. And people are starting to talk about, how do we use cell phones to process payments? So when POSs are programmable, all you have to do is just make some federation deals. And then all of a sudden, now you have 1 million merchants that can accept payment in your standard. And then you just need to put intermediaries in to act as market makers to give them the currencies that they want to deal in. That's what BitPay effectively does, is that they say, hey, if you want to accept Bitcoin, you're not actually taking it, you're taking USD, but you can take the Bitcoin and we'll deal with the volatility and we're act as traders. And that's certainly a business model. So I think over the arc of time, 5 years or 10 years, that's certainly going to be viable. In the short term, I hope we can get a debit card, but it's not something that IOHK is directly involved in. It's a Cardano Foundation, and I hope that they can make some form of an announcement at some point on that.
I don't know when you started IOHK if you ever envisioned this, but somebody in the chat just said that they got a Cardano tattoo, and to Google and look at their Twitter account for their brand new Cardano ADA tattoo. So congratulations if that's the first time. The Twitter account is LeafSid. Let's see if I can find this.
Give me a second. I got to see this.
Let's see. What do we got here?
Look at that. Yeah, I just see it. Wow, he has an ADA logo on his arm. That is so cool, man. Wow. Okay, so now we can't actually change. Well, congratulations, Leaf. We can never change the ADA currency symbol. We have to keep it the way it is for the rest of time. It's funny. Back in 2014, when I started Ethereum with Vitalik, we were having this big debate about the logo for Ethereum. We ended up with that pylon. And we had this professional design firm that was run by a guy named Wendell, and he had some ex-Apple designers with him. And they said, that pylon thing's useless. We're going to make you a proper logo. And we got all excited. We're like, wow, real design people are going to, actually decide on this thing. And Wendell says, you have to be very, very, serious about this effort, because people are going to end up tattooing this thing on their body. So this is not a minor thing, guys. You're going to permanently scar the butts of women and the backs of men and so forth. And you got to make sure it's good. So he went out with all these rock star designers, and they spent 3 weeks thinking about it. And they came back and did this presentation. And they came back, and their idea was this circle with a slash through it. This was literally their proposal for the Ethereum
Can't have that tattooed on your arm.
And I looked at it, this is the worst thing I've ever seen in my life. And I looked at Anthony Diorio and I said, Anthony, should we just stick with the pylon? He's like, yeah, let's just stick with that. And now I run into people at conferences with it tattooed on them. So it's like, well, Wendell was right, and so far that logo is great. So thanks, man. That is crazy. That is so cool.
It's breaking news on the YouTube channel. We have our first Cardano tattoo.
Wow.
Or maybe it's not the first.
Okay, next question.
Let me see here. Let's trying to dive back above the tattoo, the comments about the tattoo. Anything maybe we haven't covered? I'm trying to find a nice question to bounce things off of.
Let me look at the questions here. All right, people criticizing me, people talking about burning.
A lot of burning. Linux client for Daedalus. That I know that's kind of maybe on the roadmap as well. You had mentioned in one of the previous videos too.
Yeah, the hard part is not getting the client to work. The hard part is the auto update component of the client. So it's kind of funny because we're actually Linux first. It's like we don't have a consumer client for Linux, but all of our development takes place on Nix. It's like, and all of our developers are Linux developers. So here's the issue: we can release a Linux client really quickly, like within a week or 2 weeks. It's not so hard. But the problem is that we built a lot of logic into Daedalus for the update feature. So when you get your Windows copy of Daedalus or your Mac copy of Daedalus, when we push an update, we have an auto update system where it'll download and allow you to install that update on top of it. So to do this in Linux is possible, but you have to build a lot of infrastructure to do it and make it easy and so forth. So the question is, do we ship a Linux client without it? In which case we have a minimum viable product, you can use Linux, but then you have a more difficult upgrade path when we ship new versions of Daedalus, or do we wait a little bit, build that infrastructure out, and get around to it? So because there's been so many people who've asked for a Linux client, I think what we'll probably do is build it without that update feature and have a more difficult manual update path and let people know that another version will come that has it bundled with it, but that'll come a little bit later, probably in March or April or May or something like that. Unfortunately, you have to understand that 97% of the Ada users are Windows users based upon installations that we've seen and feedback that we've gotten. I'm sure if we had a Linux client available that those numbers would look a little different, but we're right now in a Windows world. So we have to meet the needs of that platform first, which are quite exhaustive and extensive, especially when you're dealing with Haskell, where the tools are not native Windows. Almost always they're Unix-based, they're Linux-based. And it's been a struggle for us to get all that tooling to work the way it needs to work. But it is a priority. It's just one of those things where you have to fit it in with other priorities in the organization. And there's a technical reason why it's not so simple. But we do know how to do it, and we actually are using Daedalus on Linux. It's how we test it. It's our first platform to test it on. So It's kind of ironic that that's the one we touch.
That's funny. I've gotten a few questions. Fan of elephants. I mean, excuse me, fan of giraffes, not elephants.
Yes, I like giraffes. My wife collects them, and she's a big giraffe fan. So every time I go on a trip, I buy her a giraffe and take them back home. And because I travel so much, I've accumulated a huge amount of giraffes. And what ended up happening is that by accident, some of them were left in the backdrop, and then people started commenting on it. So every time I do these interviews, she just starts putting lots of giraffes around.
Way more thoughtful than I am. So
exactly. I also have a Totoro behind me too, if anybody knows. My neighbor Totoro.
I think I've seen a couple comments about that as well. Maybe let's see if we get one last solid question here. I'll give it a minute because I think it might take a second to sync now. Somebody says you need to get a real giraffe. I don't know if that'll fit in the U.S. But
yes, I am 30. I just saw that question. Yeah, I started Ethereum when I was 25 with Vitalik back in the day, and it's been a hell of a long journey.
It's been the way the space has evolved in the past couple of years has just been absolutely crazy. And I mean, I got into crypto through Dogecoin. I don't know why, I don't know how, but that was my introduction to crypto in December 2013 was Dogecoin and paying for the Jamaican bobsled team to go to the Olympics. So definitely not as interesting as co-founding Ethereum. But hey,
one of the greatest marketing stunts I think ever done was the Tesla Roadster with SpaceX. I mean, that's just a great example of being smart about what you're doing. When you launch a rocket, usually you fill the rocket with the cargo area of the rocket with concrete. Mm-hmm. Just so you can balance the payload and you can guarantee that it can lift a certain amount of weight. Well, they said, well, since we have all this dead space, why don't we take something out there? But you can't actually take satellites or missions because if it blows up during the test, you have a huge liability. So you won't get insurance for that payload. So he said, I'll put concrete, but then I'll ship my own car that I used to drive with it, and then we'll put a camera on it. And now millions of people are watching this damn live stream of a stuffed mannequin in a car floating around the Earth. Eventually head towards Mars. It's like you can't pay for marketing like that. It's just brilliant.
That's incredible.
So yeah, the Doge bobsled team also reminded me of that, where you pay a little bit of money and you get this outsized, media presence that allows you to get national media and so forth. And anybody who can pull it off consistently, I have a huge amount of admiration for. You have to be really creative and think outside of the box for that stuff.
Totally. So maybe the last question we could take as far as Cardano goes in this conversation. So I've seen a couple different questions in regards to partnerships and maybe kind of putting that all into one as far as not necessarily just partnerships, but DApps on Cardano. What's that like as far as maybe working with developers and companies in terms of developing DApps on top of Cardano in the future? What's that process going to potentially look like in the future? And is there a specific way in which you're trying to source those individuals, or do you just let them come to you at a certain point in time as well?
Right. So there's kind of a three pipeline model there. The first pipeline is the group of developers that have been incubated by Ethereum. And so my answer to them is that you can come over and play in our pond, and it's backward compatible. So all the tools that you love to use, all the languages you use, the things you're used to will work the same in Cardano as they work in Ethereum. So your development experience can stay unmolested, and the value proposition is that you'll be more secure, faster, and cheaper to deploy your applications in our system than our competitor. Then the second group of people are the traditional developers who have yet to onboard into the system. So the Java developers, the C++ developers, the C# developers, who have decades of experience with a view of how things ought to be and really don't want to transition to a new stack. And that's why we built Yella, because what Yella gives us the ability to do is to eventually support smart contracts written in these big programming languages.
Sure.
And then people can actually build some custom tooling, but stay in Java and stay in C++ and stay in C# and so forth. And our cost to support them goes down every year because the way the K framework works and the way that Yella works. And it's an understandable framework. It's actually Yella is based on LLVM, which has been around for 13 years. Apple sponsored it and so forth. So it's a pretty understandable model. And then the third bucket are the new people who want to learn how to become developers in the space or don't have a strong preference on things. And so we have an education group at IOHK, and we've already run 2 cohorts through it, one in Athens and one in Barbados. I'm actually going to Barbados next week
Sounds terrible.
before I go to London. And basically, Barbados, we have a class with the University of West Indies, and we've been teaching a bunch of people how to become Haskell developers. And eventually we'll transition that to include Plutus and functional smart contracts. So we have a preferred way of developing dApps on our system. And we're going to expand our education efforts to eventually train tens of thousands of people using MOOCs, in-person classes, and other techniques and methods to become developers in our system. There's an overwhelming demand for this. For example, when we opened up our class in Barbados, we had in just 1 month 180 applicants.
Wow.
And we didn't really market it too much. We just didn't have space for them. So we know that we can scale this and very easily, very quickly train thousands of people, and these people will be very familiar with our view of how the contract should be written. So it's kind of a dose of pragmatism, accepting what's been done before, a dose of realism, understanding that most people won't move from the tools they're comfortable with, and then a dose of principle, where we say, okay, we'll train people to become developers within our space and make all those materials and those courses and such things open and available. They'll all be released under Creative Commons and have MOOCs and so forth. And our hope is that over an arc of time, that we can build a very strong development community around Cardano. Now, the question is, when will you be able to start testing Yella and testing EVM and so forth? Our hope is within the next 45 days to 60 days to have some form of a test net running, meaning that people can actually write smart contracts and run those smart contracts on that test net. And we're doing that as a fork of the Mantis client, where we took the ETC client that we built and we went ahead and made the VM pluggable and the consensus algorithm module pluggable. So you can put in different consensus algorithms in different virtual machines. And we'll probably launch 2 test nets, a KEVM test net and a Yella test net. So you can A/B test smart contracts on Yella versus KEVM. And that'll at the very least support Solidity. And our hope is to potentially have a Plutus compiler as well. So you can write Plutus smart contracts and Solidity smart contracts and begin playing around with it. Then it's a game of when can we iterate that experience and make it faster and better, and then pull it into Cardano by the Cardano control layer model. And that'll take a few months. It's just getting it out there and getting people around it. But it's nice because if people say, oh, but I want to write on Cardano now, I say, well, then write on Ethereum. And then you can redeploy onto Cardano, and we'll have a very natural migration path for that. And when Cardano is available, you can redeploy. For example, if you have an ERC20 token, you can literally copy the ownership ledger of that token and transfer it over and make it a Cardano ERC20. In fact, we even wrote a Cardano ERC20 K-spec. So these things are already standardized for the platform. And again, they'll run faster, better, and more securely than they will on Ethereum.
Sure. Well, At this point, maybe if anybody's not familiar with where they can find you, and or just the projects you're involved with in general, is there any just kind of as far as if it's Twitter or your websites or anything like that? I'm sure most people know where to or following you on Twitter and things like that. But any recommendations as far as what people can do to kind of keep in touch with what you're doing and the progress you're making as well?
Yeah. My Twitter feed is IOHK_Charles. So input output Hong Kong IOHK underscore Charles, and you can also go to cardanohub.org, and Cardano Hub has our all the information about the project. And very soon we're going to start announcing some things like, if you want to start a meetup group, how can we help you do that, and other little things to try to engage the community a little bit more.
Awesome.
The challenge with Byron was just getting this stuff out the door and learning how to get regular releases of software and regular QA releases, and all those types of things. And now that we have some mastery over that, the next step is really scaling up community engagement and community evangelism and management, and getting all that stuff done. And that's a high priority of ours over the next 60 days.
Awesome. Well, I appreciate you first of all coming on. I also appreciate you staying on an extra 30 minutes to speak with everybody in the chat. Super helpful, and I've been a big fan of Cardano for a while. I had somebody introduce it to me back in late September, early October, and I've been pretty fascinated with the approach you guys have been taking for quite some time. So I really appreciate the insight you provided, and I know the community itself has been very excited to hear from you. So I very much appreciate your time coming on here and giving us your background on Cardano, IOHK, as well as just some other topics as well. So thank you so much for that.
All right. Thanks, Rob. Talk to you soon.
Appreciate
Cheers.
it. Have a good one.